Birmingham, Alabama was one of America's most racially discriminated and segregated cities. It was a haven to the South's most violent Ku Klux Klan chapter. There had already been bombings in Birmingham that eventually it was stuck with the name Bombingham. 16th Street Baptist Church was a large and prominent church located in downtown Birmingham. It served as a centerpiece of the city's African American community, and it was also the oldest church in the area. It was a meeting place, social center, lecture hall, and even a headquarters for civil rights mass meetings and rallies. The church previously served as a central meeting place and a staging ground for the civil rights activities. It was intended to stall the progression of the civil rights movement. However, the tragedy had the opposite effect, galvanizing support and propelling the movement forward. On the morning of September 15, 1963, as the congregation's children prepared for the annual Youth Day celebrations, a bomb exploded in the stairwell of 16th Street Baptist Church, killing 4 girls and injuring dozens of others in the assembly. While most people got out safely, 14-year-olds Addie Mae Collins, Cynthia Wesley, and Carol Robertson, and 11-year-old Denise McNair were found dead underneath the rubble in the basement. Additionally, Sarah Collins Rudolph lost one of her eyes in the bombing. This bombing was just one of 3 bombings that had happened in a span of 11 days. This angered many black protesters, so they met at the church. Governor Wallace sent in policemen to break up the rally, but this angered the black and much more of the city. 2 more were killed and many were injured in these rallies. It got to the point where the National Guard even had to be called in. When the riots broke out, 2 African-American boys, Virgil Ware, who was 13, and Johnny Robinson, 16, were also killed, alongside 20 others who were severely injured. As previously stated, Alabama Governor George Wallace sent 500 National Guardsmen and 300 state troopers to the city to stop the riots. The next day, they were joined by 500 police officers and 150 sheriff deputies. In 1965, 4 suspects emerged: Bobby Frank Cherry, Thomas Blanton, Robert Chambliss, and Herman Frank Cash. They were all Ku Klux Klan members. The witnesses were reluctant to talk and physical evidence was lacking, so charges were not filed. The case was then closed for 11 years. In 1976, Alabama Attorney General Bill Baxley reopened the case. In 1977, Robert Chambliss is convicted of first-degree murder in connection with the bombing and sentenced to life imprisonment. In 1985, he dies in prison. In 1994, Herman Frank Cash dies without being charged of the bombing, although he was earlier suspected in 1965. In May of 2000, a grand jury in Alabama indicts former Klansmen Bobby Frank Cherry and Thomas Blanton with 8 counts of first-degree murder, 4 being counts of intentional murder and 4 being murder with universal malice. In May of 2001, Thomas Blanton is found guilty of first-degree murder and is sentenced to 4 life terms. Later, in 2002, Bobby Frank Cherry is found guilty and given a sentence of 4 life terms as well. In February of 2006, the 16th Street Baptist Church was declared a historical landmark. In 2013, 50 years after the bombing, all 4 girls who died were awarded with congressional gold medals. Later that year, a bronze and steel statue of the 4 girls was unveiled. It is located at Kelly Ingram Park on the corner of 16th Street North and 6th Avenue North. It captures the moment right before the bombing. On the feet of one of the girls in the statue, it says, "A day that moved the conscience of the United States." This shows the impact that this event had on the civil rights movement. In one of his speeches, Martin Luther King said, "What murdered these 4 girls, the apathy and the complacency of many Negro who will sit down on their stools of do-nothing and not engage in creative protest to get rid of this evil system. This shows that African Americans must now take action and protest for their sake during the civil rights movement, which they had not done prior to this event." Building off of what Martin Luther King said, President John F. Kennedy stated, "If these cruel and tragic events can only awaken that city and state, if they can only awaken this entire nation to a realization of the folly of racial injustice and hatred and violence, then it is not too late for all concerned to unite in steps toward peaceful progress before most lives are lost." Overall, the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing, although a dreaded date in history, seems to be one of the many turning points for the civil rights movement. African Americans finally came to the realization that in order to take control of their future, they must get involved in protest for their rights. Although times have changed and the issue of civil rights has been somewhat suppressed, we see a rise in a new issue of poverty amongst individuals in the United States. The definition of poverty is all of those who make less than the federal government's official poverty threshold. Examples of this are a family of 4 who makes $24,000 a year, people working at minimum wage, seniors living on fixed incomes, and wage earners suddenly out of work. In 2014, 47 million people lived in poverty USA. That means the poverty rate for 2014 was around 15%. One reason for the extreme poverty is that many people do not receive welfare assistance. There has been a program made called the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families, or TANF. It gives states the option to put federal money to ancillary programs or as cash handouts. For the most part, this program only helps those with a job. TANF only benefits 4.4 million people, and most people living in poverty don't even realize that the program still exists, so they don't apply. A second cause for poverty is that in the U.S., people depend on a shadow economy. These people go a while with little to no cash, but they are in desperate need of money to pay bills, so they start doing drastic things to get cash. One way people living in poverty get cash is by selling their plasma to hospitals. This is allowed twice a week per person by law. Another cause of poverty is that these people are not disconnected from the workforce. Many people assume poor people are looking for jobs, but in reality they aren't. Most people living in poverty did have a job at one point, but were let go and things went downhill from there. There are not nearly as many factories and manufacturing companies today as there once was. These jobs used to require no college education and therefore were great for unskilled people. But because very few of these jobs still exist, it's hard for people living in poverty to find employment. When looking at the history of poverty, a lot of it began with industrialization and immigration. These times brought poverty of a new kind and on a new scale to American cities in the 1820s, intensifying the economic crisis of the late 1830s and the 1850s. Additionally, after the Civil War, the poorest part of the country was the South, where both whites and African Americans struggled with debt. Adding on that, the Great Depression brought up a lot of additional economic struggles. Among these are buying on the margin, buying on credit, supply and demand, the stock market crash, and drought. The Great Depression affected everyone, from the very young to the very old. Everyone's lives were changed drastically by the events of this period. Many people found themselves out of work and searching for a better life. Children had to deal with changes in their education. Teenagers and their parents were traveling to search for a new life, and the middle class had to deal with a life without money and security. In summary, the Great Depression simply caused lots of poverty at a single moment. To combat poverty, many organizations have been established. Many food insecure households participate in these programs. One of the most popular is SNAP, or Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, where people use food stamps. SNAP provides monthly food benefits to struggling individuals and families. 93% of SNAP benefits go to households with incomes below the federal poverty line. In addition, federal farm programs began during the Great Depression when 1/4 of the U.S. population lived on farms. This was a safety net for farmers during rough times. The government would buy the food from the farms. The only bad thing is that it generally supported bigger, wealthier farms with subsidies even though they didn't need it as much. To combat this issue, the Farm Bill was made, which provides an opportunity to reshape the current broken agricultural policies and build a more just framework that better serves small and medium-sized family farms in the United States. It also helps overcome hunger and helps vulnerable farmers. Currently, there is a raging debate about whether or not the minimum wage should be raised. The minimum wage was initially made to reduce poverty and today is set at $7.25. Many supporters of the minimum wage say that it increases the standard of living and keeps people out of poverty. They also say it stimulates consumption, puts more money in the economy, and increases work ethic. Those who are opposed to it tend to believe that it increases unemployment and harms the less skilled workers. Today, no decision has yet been made due to the many opposing views. With this current issue of poverty in America, many are trying to overcome it with bills, organizations, and debates. As this problem is discussed, America struggles to find a solution, but hopes for one at some point in the near future.